Good afternoon everyone and welcome back to the NPTEL online course Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. So for today's lecture we will be focusing on resource rights which is a very important part when it comes to tribal studies in India or tribal communities. Now within resource rights we will be talking about three broad issues pertaining to natural resources, that is land, forest and water. So land, forest and water, as you know are pivotal to any human existence, and in the context of tribes the issue becomes more pertinent because these resources are not only viewed as economic resources, but they also have a lot of symbolic and cultural meanings associated with them. Now in the last 100 years or so, when one talks about issues pertaining to natural resources, their control and the question of access, particularly in the context of tribal societies, one of the most contested issue that tribal communities face today and as well as in the past, particularly with the onset of colonial rule, was the way in which property relations were altered, and particularly with the coming of the colonial state or the British that introduced a different notion of property. So we will try to understand the process in which these changes was taking place and the kind of socio-economic impact it has on the tribes. Now as you know, in the context of tribal society, what I also wanted to focus through this lecture is the issue of dispossession. Now and land is something which is very central to tribal social life, and in the course of this lecture we will try to understand how this the introduction of new land system, new property regimes, particularly with the coming of the British rule, and that also resulted into a new kind of economic deprivation, essentially because tribes were denied access to natural resources and particularly land. Now like I said, every community, every human being requires land. Land is very fundamental to the existence of any society, any civilizations. Now so in the context of tribal society, land is a very important support system around which the tribal economy and knowledge systems have evolved. Now these tribal knowledge systems meant to nurture and manage resources at its most sustainable level without disturbing the ecological balance. Now in some of my previous lectures we have already talked about in brief the idea of ecological romanticism. Now many a times it is very easy to paint this picture of trying to project tribal communities in harmonious relationship with nature. So there is an element of truth in the kind of criticisms that we are seeing, that tribes also exploit resources for their survival. Tribes also exploit resources to meet their ends. Tribes also utilize resources for various other things. Now but at the same time it is also important to understand that beyond this economic reductionism, it is important to understand that the socio-cultural life world of the people revolves heavily around these resources, including land. So therefore a disruption in the property relations, a disruption in the linkages between the society, between the community and the land, definitely not only have economic implications but also have a lot of socio-cultural implications as well. Now in many tribal society, why is this happening? Why is it that the community is facing a lot of issues, a lot of challenges when this relationship between the community and natural resources such as land gets disrupted? It is essentially because the nature of property relations in tribal society is predominantly community based, and their main sustenance is based on this common property or community land that in today we call it common property resources. So therefore their dependence on common property resources gets reflected in their community life. Now this is an important point to understand that in many parts of India or even the world, if you look at tribal societies or indigenous societies, one is that hardly there is any notion of say private property. Now even if there is a notion of private property, it does not imply that a single individual will own vast amount of land or vast amount of resources. Now mostly the preferred system is ownership by the community. So therefore what does this do? It essentially means that the community have a stake in the resources. So therefore the exploitation of the resources, the nature of access of resources are also being curtailed and controlled by the community. Now everyone have a stake in the maintenance of natural resources, including land. So, in the context of tribal society, there is therefore this very strong nexus between natural resources such as land and their livelihood system, which is based on their values, beliefs, practices and cultural norms. Now, like I said, the nature of property ownership system, sometimes we call it as customary, sometimes we call it as a more traditional method of organizing the economic systems. Sometimes we even call it as informal, or sometimes even backward. But at the same time, if you try to understand this relationship between tribes and resources from the perspective of the community, then you will have a very different understanding about resources, the way in which what resources means to tribal communities. So, many tribal communities do not necessarily see land, for instance, or forest or water as mere resources. They see it as givers, providers of their needs. So, therefore, there is a strong element of belief system that is there within in the way in which they look at natural resources. So, there is also a lot of there is this intrinsic connection between their socio-cultural, their beliefs, their everyday life world and the natural resources. Now, for instance, there is this scholar which was cited by Shimrey, who notes that those who regard the natural landscape as sacred, the idea of land as private property, as a marketable commodity is inconceivable. Most of the eco-societies believe that in the beginning God gave the people, as the tribe are often known to themselves a territory and its resources from which they were to supply their physical needs. Now, what we can understand is that there is a clash of views in terms of the way indigenous or tribal communities view resources and the way in which the so-called modern society view resources. Now, from the 18th century onwards, before the 18th century, particularly in the pre-enlightenment period, we know that it was more or less the monarchical system of governance that was prevailing. But after that, in the post-enlightenment period and with the emergence of capitalism, we have seen that the spread of this private property, where feudalism was buried and capitalism emerged out of feudalism. Now, what it did was this emergence of this notion of private property. Now, whenever the colonial state went, they began to introduce new systems of private property, and that essentially was that new systems of property ownership, and that essentially was the introduction of private ownership. Now, in the context of tribal society, so therefore, there is this clash of views or clash of this understanding when it comes to resources. From the tribal point of view, resources belongs to everyone. Resources has to be shared. Now, in the context of from the so-called modern society, properties are all privately owned. It has to be recorded. It has to be legible to the state, and it is a commodity where where the ownership or where the ownership or people make profit out of such such resources. So, on the basis of such concepts and ecological parameters of tribals, land and forests also have a property value in the form of an individual's landed property that is socially recognized as such within the given territory of tribal communities. Now, in many parts of India today, all of us know that we cannot think outside of the box in terms of how to regulate our social life, and that is quite true because we only think that everything has to be individually owned. So, therefore, we own our houses, we buy property, we record it in our names, right. So, but in the context of many tribal society, if you go to places like, for instance, Arunachal Pradesh, or even in Nagaland, or even in among the tribal communities in Manipur, you will see that they continue to have this something known as common property resources. Now, many a times for the state, it means that the state label all this CPR as being governed under customary laws. Now, in many tribal societies, these common property resources, and if there are the existence of any individual land, they were all maintained and controlled by traditional mechanism of their customary law and management systems. Such control of land and territory was intrinsic to their livelihood. Now, what are some of the features of this traditional notion of customary law? For instance, most of the time they are unwritten, so it is not written in paper, right. But in the context of modern society, you will see that any form of property, if someone is to claim that it belongs to me, then they should be in a position to prove that it actually belongs to them. So, any kind of property, whether in the form of in the form of house, whether in the form of any kind of land, so it has to be recorded. But if you go and see the nature of property relations in tribal society, in many tribal society, you will see that there is still this notion that is being practiced, that the community owns the land, right. Now, even in Manipur, among Naga society, you will see that there are still a lot of common property resources, where all the villages, everyone in the village have the right to utilize and access such resources. So, therefore, it is very common to see that many tribal communities have a very deep sentimental attachment and socio-cultural orientation towards the land on which they live. This attachment gives both an individual and the community a sense of belonging to a place. It is an important social and cultural phenomenon because it is deeply rooted in their homestead, landed property, relatives, clan and community in general. Now, the foundation of tribal society is not only about the way in which the social structure or they are socially organized. It has a lot to do with the economic organization of the society. And many a times in tribal society, you cannot separate the two. The social and the economic are quite interlinked. Now, if you go and talk to any say community from Nagas community, for instance, they will always talk about something known as the ancestral land. Essentially, it means that the land that they occupy today, the land that in which they are living today, it has been passed down from generation to generation, and therefore they don't call it merely their village. It is they will specifically refer to it as an ancestral land. It means that their ancestor, their great grandfathers, grandparents have nurtured the land, have tilled the land. So, therefore, they continue to pass down such notions, and therefore people begin to have a lot of deep emotional attachment to the land, and they also take care of the land. So, therefore, this kind of sentimental attachment is something which is quite peculiar and common in the context of tribal society. Now, not only in Naga society, if you look at many other parts of India, even in mainland India, you will see that the idea of property, the idea of who owns the land, the idea of who owns the forest, the idea of whose forests, whose water, whose rivers are they, it is quite different because of the absence of this notion of private property. Now, in the context of common property resources, like I said, the idea is that everyone owns, everyone is part of it, everyone has a role to play. Now, if anything is made a private property, it means that you are making a kind of enclosure, right? You are claiming that this belongs only and only to you, right? No one have the right to come and access. So, everyone who is trying to come and access without their permission, without the person who is claiming that this property or this land belongs to them, they become a trespasser, right? So, but in the context of tribal society, you will see that in many parts of India, particularly in regions like Northeast India, you will see that common property resources continues to define the economic life of the communities. Now, so like I said, since it is, you cannot separate the social and the economic, you cannot separate the socio cultural life of the people with the economic organization of the society. So, therefore, the moment the introduction of with the introduction of new laws, new regulations pertaining to land, and particularly with the coming of the British, it continued to have a lot of adverse implications for tribal societies, and it is also a very serious issue, because one of the most contested issue when it comes to tribal society even till today is the question of land alienation. What it means is that over a period of time, tribal communities are being forcefully evicted from their lands, from their homes. At the same time, they are being continually dispossessed, probably for reasons like construction of dams, construction of or infrastructure projects like setting up of steel plants, or hydroelectric projects, so on and so forth. So, however, we will try to look at the way in which the colonial state have laid the ground that enable the process of dispossession. So, prior to the introduction of land related laws by the colonial administration, the tribal communities had their own land structure and divisions. Traditionally, most tribal communities have three-tier land ownership system. One is the community land, second is the individual land, and third is the clan land. Now, we have already learned and understood that tribal societies are largely based on kinship, right? Now, when a society is based on kinship, it means that more or less the village or the social unit in the village, in the community is quite homogeneous, in the sense that they all belong to one or two clans. Now, the economic life of the community revolves around clans, revolves around kins. So, in terms of property relations also, you will see that definitely this is not to say that there is no there is a total absence of individual ownership of land. Communities do own land, right? Communities, like I said, do own land. It is not that they own vast amounts of land, right, where no other family or no other individual have the possibility of owning any land. Now therefore, in most tribal societies you will see this three-tier land ownership. The first is the community land, second is the individual land. So in the community land, everyone have the right to access, right, maybe in terms of forest, or maybe in terms of utilizing the land for some purposes that serve the community interest. The individual land, mostly the homestead, or maybe some some portion of land which for example for kitchen gardening, some amount of land which an individual may own, and comes the clan land. Now the community land and the clan land are mostly shared, and many a times these things are very important because to for the communities, because it serves as a kind of social security in times of their needs. So clan land, community land are very, very important. Its tribal community had well defined boundaries and traditional administrative systems based on customary law. Despite the diversity in terms of in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of their religion, or in terms of the region that they live, something which is very, very common across tribal communities is the customary law. So most tribal communities will have their distinct customs, distinct traditions that they follow, through which they govern themselves. Now these customary laws, again, most of the time they are unwritten, mostly passed down through the medium of the oral. Now today with modernization there are so many socioeconomic changes that is happening, for which many tribal communities today have reduced their customary law into written form. Now Mizo communities is a classic example, a community which has reduced their customary law into a proper written form, and it has been amended again and again. But like I said, most tribal communities in India, they have customary laws, but these are largely unwritten laws. So this, however, despite the fact that they are unwritten laws, they had definite rules on who could cultivate what land and in which season. Normally it was controlled by the village councils or the village elders, which was made up of men alone. Tribal women had more control over zoom production than their counterparts did in settled agriculture. However, the situation of access to land by both men and particularly with women has changed with the coming of the colonial rule. So one of the first land laws that was introduced by the British was the permanent settlement in 1793 in Bengal, which was later on extended to regions of central India like Chotanagpur, which had a very, very significant tribal population. And through this, the British, began to introduce this zamindari system, of which over a period of time began to forcefully alienate tribal communities from land. Now this process of alienation disrupted traditional tribal system of communal land ownership, as zamindars were granted absolute ownership, leading to widespread tribal dispossession. Now for the colonial state, this was after industrial revolution, feudalism began to diminish in Europe, and the only way, a new idea that was becoming very, 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 very popular was private property. And now that thinkers like John Locke have advocated for the introduction of private property, and many people think that if the property does not belong to you, if the property is not privately owned, why should people even invest in the land? Why should people make use of the kind of resources that is made available to them? So therefore there was a lot of justifications as to why private property is the only way for progress and prosperity. So therefore there was this clash of views when it comes to property relations, and since the colonial state was in authority and was in power, it was capable of enforcing their beliefs and their ideas, and that came with the introduction of the permanent settlement in 1793 in Bengal. Now over a period of time, what we see is that starting from 1793, we began to gradually see this dispossession of tribal communities from their land, and the tribal lands were taken over by non-tribal landlords. In Jharkhand, this is a very, very popular term, or in the Chotanagpur region, the Dikus, often through fraud or coercion, forcing many Adivasis into landlessness. Land was increasingly used for cash crops instead of subsistence farming, affecting tribal food security. Now one of the motive of introducing this permanent settlement was for the purpose of revenue. At the same time, another issue that that took place during the colonial period was the introduction of plantation systems. Now British began to introduce a lot of commercial cultivation. Now say for example in regions like West Bengal, particularly in areas like Siliguri, Darjeeling, they have started with introduced tea plantations. Likewise in Northeast India also, in Assam, where many communities have this idea of follow or practice common property common property relations. What happened is that with the introduction of tea plantations, all these common properties were changed to private property. It means that the British have altered property relations in places like Assam to enable the process of tea plantations in Assam. Now, so what does it mean? It means that communities, people, individuals are being continually deprived from access and ownership of their lands. So over a period of time, many tribals were reduced to tenants or laborers on the same land that they once owned. Now the situation has changed to an extent that the people who were actually the owners of the land become laborers in their own land. So many other laws and regulations were introduced, and one of them was by Captain Wilkinson, who formulated a salutary rule for the prohibition of sale, transfer and mortgage of land for arrears of rent or debt belonging to the Adivasis. However, the officials often exercised this power in favor of landlords and outsiders, effectively legitimizing the dispossession of Adivasi land. So it was very clear to the colonial state that tribal communities were not happy. There was a lot of resentment, there was a lot of anger and protest against land dispossession as well. It was for this reason also that if you recall some of the previous lectures, the question of colonial rule, the question of freedom from colonialism for the tribes was not only freedom from the colonial state. It was also freedom from being controlled and dominated by what they call the Dikus, that is the outsiders. Now in the context of tribal society, many scholars have also looked at how dominant communities in India have actually played a significant role in their marginalization. So many a times however, despite the colonial state recognizing that these communities are facing a lot of exploitation, a lot of dispossession, but then many a times they ended up reinforcing the wishes and the interests of the landlords and the outsiders. Institutions like courts also did not recognize traditional tribal claims to land because Adivasis lack formal records or legal documents. Like I said, there is no system of writing. Many tribal communities even till today have no systems of writing. So it means that when the land and when property relations is defined by this idea of common property, what it means is that the boundaries between land, say, but the boundaries of properties are also very fluid, very fuzzy. It's not that people are demarcating, okay, this is my land, this is where your land begins, this is where your property, this is where my property ends, this is where your begins. So there is such no clear demarcation. And at the same time, even despite being the real owners of the land, since they have no land records, like I said, everything was in the oral, the courts did not recognize the claim by the communities to their own land. So this lack of documented ownership enabled outsiders to seize tribal land legally. So the regulation, instead of securing tribal rights over lands, introduced new laws to strengthen landlord-tenant relations. So another important act was the Chotanagpur Tenure Act, which was aimed to prohibit land sales to outsiders, prevent the mortgaging of tribal lands, and allow limited land transfer within the Munda community. However, in reality, while appearing to protect Adivasi land, the Act primarily reinforced British administrative control over land ownership and rent collection, ensuring continued exploitation under colonial rule. Now what we see is that, like I said, there was this realization that there is a lot of anger and resentment against the kind of dispossession that the communities were experiencing, and it was for the first time that tribes were being continually dislocated, continually dispossessed from their lands. Now several efforts were being introduced by the colonial state, but then what actually happened on the ground? On paper there were efforts, but what happened actually in the ground was that it only ended up reinforcing the interests of the colonial state. So after the introduction of the Zamindari system by the British, the newly arrived Zamindars to force Adivasis to work in the Raja's land. The British later legalized this. In 1890, the Commissioner of Chotanagpur issued a proclamation requiring forced labor of 14 days, which was extended to 60 to 84 days by Zamindars. So it is not only that the colonial state was exploiting the tribes. Now you will see that under the Zamindari system, the Zamindars were actually also engaged in the perpetuation and exploitation of tribal communities. So in many tribal areas, with the colonial state have paved the way for the entry of Zamindars. What this means is that many Adivasis they were made to work, forcefully work in the Raja's land. It means that in the land of the zamindars. So many a times they were not paid, they were poorly paid, or they were totally unpaid at all. So these kind of new forms of systemic exploitation, new forms of bondage also began to take roots. Another important act that was introduced by the colonial state, which is even in use still today in the context of India, was the Land Acquisition Act of 1894. Now, the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 is a very important legal instrument when it comes to the question of land. So, the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 is a very important legal instrument of economic control, oppression and exploitation promulgated by the British imperialist government. It allowed the British to take land from Indians under the pretext of public use while promising compensation to the owners. This gave them control over land, which was essential for people's survival and justified their actions as being for the public good. Now, a central feature of Land Acquisition Act of 1894 is the idea of eminent domain. Now, what is the eminent domain? The eminent domain essentially in simple words means that the state has the sovereign power over any kind of resources. Now, this justification of the state as the rightful owner of any resources is being made on the basis that the utilization of these resources, whether it is alienating vast majority of people, is for the public good or public purpose. So therefore, the colonial state began to acquire vast amounts of lands. Now, in post-colonial period also, we continue to witness this process of acquiring vast amount of lands using similar act and using similar justification. That is, people need to sacrifice. Some people have to make sacrifice for industrialization to happen, and these things are justified on the basis that it is for the common good. All of this collectively continue the process of tribal land alienation and exploitation in central India. Similarly, in northeastern part of India, tribal land alienation began with the introduction of the Assam Land and Revenue Regulation in 1886. It laid the foundation for revenue collection, land tenure systems and tribal land production in the region. Now, in northeast India, you know that northeast India is a very diverse region. There are in total 7 states, and in many states, tribal communities are the dominant communities, such as in Meghalaya, Nagaland, Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, so on and so forth. But then a very pivotal period, colonial period in particular, was very pivotal in the if one looks at the economic history of the region, primarily because the Assam Land and Revenue Regulations, which was introduced in 1886, laid a foundation for the establishment of new property regimes in the region. Now, why Assam? Essentially because it was in Assam that the colonial state have initiated tea plantations or commercial activities like rubber plantation as well. So therefore, to take away, to break down the property from largely community owned to private owned. So what the British did was introduce new laws and regulations to define and redefine property relations in the state. Now, the Assam Land and Revenue Regulations continue to remain foundational, because it was from these particular legislations that other states in the region also began to introduce new legislations following the ones that was introduced by the British. Now, the colonial state also introduced the concept of scheduled districts and later excluded and partially excluded areas to safeguard tribal land rights. It also prohibited the transfer of land from indigenous communities to outsiders without government approval. However, at the same time, it also dissolved the customary rights of tribals over land. Now, in many parts of northeast India, so the colonial state, through the Government of India Act 1919, it introduced something known as the partially excluded and excluded areas. Now, the partially excluded areas in the context of northeast is essentially today's Meghalaya, but most of the partially excluded areas are in central India. When it comes to the excluded areas, particularly like today's Nagaland, Mizoram and Arunachal Pradesh, most of the laws which are being implemented outside it were not applicable within the excluded areas. So it means that there was some kind of protection that was being laid down by the British to serve the interests of the tribes. But however, within the communities, it was not that there was no change being initiated by the colonial state. Many changes was happening, and these changes was also happening in relation to property relations or the economic life of the people. So in many parts of northeast India, even in regions which were under the excluded areas, the colonial state was capable of altering the customary rules or the customs governing land. So therefore, we began to see a lot of contestations pertaining to customary laws, particularly in relation to land among many tribal communities after the entry of the British in these regions. Now, this allowed the classification of land as government land, reserve land and wasteland. Vast stretches of land were now used for tea plantations, timber extraction and revenue generation at the expense of indigenous communities. Now, many of the laws and regulations that was introduced by the colonial state enabled the British to have access and rightful claim by which they began to introduce plantations, right. The plantation economy in Northeast India will not be possible without bringing in new legislations. It was new legislations that allowed this to happen. Apart from that, the colonial state was not only engaged in tea plantations, it was also engaged in timber extraction, it was also engaged in revenue generation from peasants and farmers all across the region. Now, what about the post-colonial period? What happened in the post-colonial period? Did this process of dispossession that tribal communities witnessed under the hands of the colonial state halted, decreased, or it has only worsened? So, in the post-colonial period, the issue of development induced land alienation was something which was very, very common. It was pervasive across India, particularly in central India. And therefore, you will see that many social movements have emerged in these regions that essentially question the model, the kind of development that we are following, because it only resulted into the pauperization of tribal communities. Now, to come to the post-colonial period, modernization also has elements that are being imposed on indigenous communities without them being prepared for it. A major source of changes in land ownership system, land ownership is development projects that are presented as modernization of economy. A major area of such modernization is development projects. Now, in post-colonial period, India just came out from the yoke of colonial rule. And what nationalist leaders plan and think about visualize for the nation was that to take the country forward. And to take the country forward, so many things have to be done, and one among them was the creation of infrastructure. So therefore, there was a lot of introduction of infrastructure projects, from railways to steel plants to hydropower projects, so on and so forth. Now, these introductions are essentially viewed as a way to modernize Indian society. So it was a way to come out of our backward and difficult condition that the colonial state has left us with in 1947. In Northeast India, the indigenous communities living there face several such displacement-induced threats. Despite legal protections under the 6th schedule, indigenous peoples are often recognized as displaced persons due to lack of land records. Resistance movements have emerged, but many communities are forced to accept displacement under state pressure. Some major projects that pose such threats include Tipamuk project in Manipur, Gumti Dam in Tripura, Bhairabi Dam in Mizoram, and so on. Now, like I said, in the post-colonial period, so many development projects, infrastructure projects were introduced, and there are different kind of estimates, because it is very difficult to give an accurate picture of the extent of this dispossession. But then there are some scholars who estimate that at least 40% of the people who are being displaced by development projects in the post-colonial period belong to tribal communities. And all of us know that tribal communities constitute only about 8.6% of India's population. Now, for a population which is only about 8.6%, contributing 40% of the total displaced population in post-colonial India is quite huge. Now, even in Northeast India, many a times people assume that Northeast India have strong legal protections under 6th schedule. Now, it is important to mention that not every tribal communities in the region are under 6th schedule, but at the same time, even for communities who are under 6th schedule, it is not that they are not experiencing any kind of dispossession. There are always threats and fears related to their dispossession from their lands. Now, this has come up particularly strongly in states like Manipur, Tripura, Mizoram, even in Nagaland, Meghalaya, so on and so forth. So, several cases of land alienation of tribals have also occurred in central India in the post-independent period. Some of these include, the most prominent ones we know is the Narmada Valley project of Madhya Pradesh that displaced thousands of tribal families, the Hirakud Dam project in Odisha, which led to the displacement of the Gonds and the Baiga tribes, the Post Steel project in Odisha, and many more. Now, if you look at these major projects, one of the thing is also that most of the tribal areas are also very, very rich in resources. So therefore, they face a lot of threats, they face a lot of challenges in terms of trying to protect any kind of intrusion from outsiders. Now it becomes very challenging and very difficult for them to maintain to protect themselves from being dispossessed from their lands. But in the post colonial period, most development projects are undertaken in areas which are predominantly inhabited by tribal communities. So therefore, what we are seeing is that over the last 75 years of India's independence, this possession or land alienation is one of the most serious issues facing tribal society, tribal communities, and even till today this continues to hold true. So there were several revisions, there were several amendments which was being made to the original land acquisition law, which we already talked about, which was introduced by the British in 1894. Now 1894 Act was replaced by the land acquisition law and allows land acquisition for private companies and public-private partnership. While acknowledging special provisions for scheduled areas and the Forest Rights Act, it still facilitates involuntary displacement and forcible acquisition of forests in 5th schedule. There were attempts even by the colonial state to actually ensure that the tribal communities are affected less, or to minimize the kind of impacts that the communities are facing. So therefore, because of the kind of pressure, because of the kind of movements that the colonial state as well as the post the Indians have witnessed in the past, there were efforts to amend laws that will actually minimize this alienation of land. What we are seeing is that these laws again only ended up in facilitating involuntary displacement, and this is not only in the 6th schedule area, this is also happening in the 5th schedule area as well. So essentially what we continue to see is that there is this continual dispossession of land resulting into land alienation. In the post liberalization era, this process of land alienation in India have only speeded up. Thus, the trajectory of tribal land alienation from colonial to the post-colonial period reflects enduring challenges in balancing development with the protection of indigenous land rights, calling for a more equitable and sustainable approach. Now, many a times when we live in modern society, we cannot just think outside of the box in terms of if they do not have private property, if their properties are not being made legible to the state, in a sense that they are not being recorded, they don't have they are not registering their lands, or they are not ready to switch from common property or communal land ownership to private land ownership, then the problem sometimes is we are treating the communities as a problem. Now from the tribal perspective, if you start looking things from the tribal perspective, then you will see that this is something which is working for them, and the system of the property systems that they are following are not introduced some few years ago. This has been passed down from generation to generation, but with modernization, with industrialization, many other associated developments that we see in human societies and human history, it become increasingly challenging, and particularly in the context of tribal society, these challenges has come from this persistent land alienation that they are facing starting from the colonial period, and the introduction of this notion of private property in particular have had these adverse consequences that we continue to see in the context of tribal society till today. Now across India, one common thing that any tribal community face is the issue of land alienation. And since land have a lot of symbolic value and people are strongly attached to the land, so sometimes it resulted into different kind of anger, different kind of protests, different kind of movements also have emerged from within the communities. So therefore, to understand tribal society, to understand the tribal condition in contemporary India, one has to historicize the problem. Secondly, to really appreciate the kind of challenges facing tribal society, we also have to realize and analyze the fact that these communities have a very different conceptions about property. These communities have a very different conceptions about natural resources. So today, to summarize what I have tried to convey in this lecture is essentially that the issue of natural resources, particularly land, is something which is very central when it comes to tribal society, and this issue is not is a very old issue. It's a very old problem, and the problem begins to magnify itself particularly after the colonial period. And with the colonial period, we have seen that new laws and legislations were being introduced, and these laws and legislations, many of which were introduced by the colonial state, continue to be followed and practiced even in post-colonial India. It means that the process of land alienation did not stop with the end of colonial rule. It continues even in the post-colonial period, and even till today as we are speaking, the issue continues to significantly continues to be one of the most relevant issue facing tribal society even till today, and therefore it is very important to have a clear understanding of what actually is happening. and how to solve the problem, by having a clear understanding, of the issue by historicizing it as well. Thank you so much.